This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of Jacques Lacan. Today's video, the final video on Seminar 5, covers lectures 24 to 28. In the schema presented by Lacan in this seminar, there are two horizontal lines that have been previously identified as signifying chains, which here in lecture 24, he first formulates as the demand for the satisfaction of need for the lower line and the demand for love for the upper line. Lacan indicates that we should consider these lines as always superimposed upon one another, such that when a particular object is demanded, there lies behind that overt demand a covert demand for love. Or said in other terms, what I ask for is not what I actually want. For analysis, these two lines are thought of in terms of suggestion and transference, respectively. So to understand how that connection is made, we have to define some of these terms. Suggestion here refers not only to the active directing of the patient by the analyst towards some ideal or value, but also more broadly, it marks a way in which the analyst responds to and supports the patient's demands made of the analyst, a demand that the analyst be the source of all knowledge for the patient's ills. So suggestion then is the analyst's mistaken assumption that they do in fact possess that knowledge, as opposed to being merely in the position of the subject supposed to know. The demands made by patients vary widely, from immediate cures to deeper explorations of self or aspirations to become analysts themselves. It makes me think about how often, such as here on YouTube, there is a constant search for gurus who will provide the answers to life problems. That search is the expression of a demand. And sure enough, there are those who emerge to meet that demand by proclaiming with full confidence and authority how I am supposed to conduct my life. According to Lacan, those demands and the attempts to meet them through suggestion are effective only because of transference. Transference is the sort of halo around which these demands are made. He calls it the horizon of every signifying articulation and the fundamental background to every formulation of a demand. In analysis, the goal is then to move past suggestion by interpreting the transference that is the condition for the possibility of the demand that every suggestion is a response to. As such, transference is not just a replication of suggestion, but offers a potential for analyzing and understanding it and the demand that it responds to. Analytically, maintaining the distinction between suggestion and transference requires that the analyst not ratify the demand, and yet it's also the case that the distinction between the two can never be fully abolished, because between them, between the demand for need and the demand for love, or suggestion and transference, is the field of desire. And it is this split that is what maintains the subject. Desire then resides in an intermediary zone between the demand for the satisfaction of needs and the demand for love. This zone is structured in the locus of the other. That structured relationship to desire is indicated by the subject's unconscious fantasy, which is the support of desire and which gets attached to an object in a particular manner. In light of this, a more desirable analytic technique should focus on the nuanced handling of signifiers, maintaining a broader, more open interpretive stance toward the demands that are made. In the context of obsessional neurosis, the therapeutic approach overly simplifies the complex dynamics of a patient's desire by reducing it to a response to a demand. Such an approach, while it may produce certain effects, does not lead to the cure effect expected from psychoanalytic treatment. Instead, it results in a regressive reduction of the patient's symptoms and desires to the level of immediate demands made in relation to the analyst. This reduction is exemplified by the patient's acting out, such as the described incident in this particular lecture, the patient seeking the woman as phallus, which represents a reemergence of repressed desires in a compulsive form. Lecture 26 provides an insightful examination of how the graph of desire maps onto obsessional and hysterical neuroses. However, where it connects up with the previous two lectures is in the ongoing discussion and elaboration of the two levels that are topographically represented by that graph. In this lecture, we consider these levels in terms of two circuits, the symbolic circuit and the imaginary circuit, though we do have to be careful not to lose the dialectical relation between the two. And so the lower level is where the symbolic is reduced to imaginary relationships, and the upper level concerns where imaginary relations are taken up by the symbolic. Lacan begins by reiterating how the inclusion of the symbolic circuit for the human animal is what distinguishes it from other animals, and that language and the symbolic order more generally is not reducible to the mechanisms of classical conditioning described by the behaviorist. The signifier is different from the bell that signals to the animal that it's time to eat, a la Pavlov's studies on classical conditioning. In other words, for the human animal, there cannot be this one-to-one relation between needs and signifiers, despite our acts of signification, wherein there is an investment in a particular imaginary meaning that mistakenly is thought to be rigidly identified with the signifier. Human language is not just a more complicated form of this conditioning, such as the whistle signaling the horn that signals the bell that signals the food, through the chaining process of classical conditioning. And a reason why this system does not map onto the human reality is because there is never some original object that we finally arrive at, some unconditioned stimulus, so to speak, which in the case of Pavlov's research was the food. Sure, we need food to survive, as an example of a natural object, and so long as we remain living creatures, we will remain tethered to something natural like food, as would be the case for any animal. But the difficulty comes into play in the degree of complexity which the symbolic order introduces and which overlays and transforms the order of the real to such an extent that demands articulated by the signifiers and the objects that are overtly the aim of those demands never arrive at their so-called original natural foundation. I am never merely asking for food, or being given food never purely satisfies, because the food that is asked for and that is given is never merely what I am demanding. And it's this discordance between the apparent need being demanded and the implicit demand within the demand for an implicit object, which gives rise to the two circuits of the imaginary and the symbolic. Such a discordance cannot be appreciated without also taking into account the function of the big other here. First, as should be well known by now, the big other is the locus of signifiers, and thus the means by which the subject learns to articulate need as demand. But at the same time, the big other, the one of whom a demand is made for something, becomes itself the object of a demand, an unconditioned demand for love. As such, every particular demand henceforth becomes a demand for love. And so when I ask for food, when I ask for a gift, what I'm asking for is the other and their love, which, yes, gets reduced, truncated to this or that object, but because it never satisfies, it's really always the demand for this perpetual presence of the other, an unconditioned love. And it is here where the two circuits first play themselves out in the early development of the subject. A critical developmental juncture occurs in the confrontation with a beyond of this other. So up to this point, the other has been the omnipotent imposing figure, the maternal superego, as Lacan has called it in the seminar, a real threatening presence coterminous with a symbolic absence. However, absence here is principally about the absence of love that is being demanded for. And as such, if the other is absent, it must suggest the other's own incompleteness, that the other is lacking in some way, and as such, must be absent because it desires something else, something other than the subject. And this, in turn, suggests that there is an other for the other, an other that is the possibility of the first other being symbolized, an other who is a regulating force for the first other, and to whom this first other is subject to, the other as the law. In moving to this step and recognizing that the other is marked by a signifier and thus incomplete, the subject in turn, and as we saw in the previous video, is able to recognize, potentially, their own incompleteness and thus arrive at the unconscious realization of not being the thing that can complete the first other, of not being what is called here the phallus. And thus the subject has to confront their own inevitable lack. This lack of the imaginary phallus is then assumed by the symbolic as a signifier that can represent this lack. And the positioning the subject has in relation to this symbolic object has tremendous implications for the structural configuration of that subject, whether it's a hysterical or obsessional structure, for instance. And in mentioning obsessional and hysterical neurosis, I won't try to repeat what was already said in the last video, but we can perhaps further appreciate what was said in that video following what Lacan has presented to us here in the lecture. The hysteric's relationship with desire is to seek to sustain it. It is sustained by ensuring the object of desire remains distinct from the object of need that is articulated through demand. Doing so requires both provoking or eliciting the lack in the other on the symbolic circuit, while on the imaginary circuit also identifying with the little other who is perceived as desiring in a way similar to how the subject desires, and thus is a way for the subject to maintain their own desire. And again, we saw this in the example of Dora, who identifies with Herr K as a little other in the position of the little other for being perceived as desiring Frau K. The obsessional's relationship with desire is marked by a pattern of self-destruction and disappearance as it approaches fulfillment. To avoid obtaining what one desires while also trying to maintain desire, this obsessional subject must try to maintain a distance from their own desire and does so by anchoring it in their demands, as opposed to the hysteric who seeks to emphasize the difference between desire and demand. Doing so requires the destruction of the other, of their desire, by turning them into an object, a much more thorough attempt of collapsing the symbolic into the imaginary than we might see in the hysterical neurosis. This destruction, Lacan states, is mostly of a verbal nature, using words and signifiers to diminish and control the other, which Lacan exemplifies using Freud's case of the rat man who diminishes his father to the level of common objects in a fit of rage, illustrating the obsessional's need to manage the overwhelming presence of the other by reducing it to something controllable and inert. Yet at the same time, this use of signifiers in destroying the other is also what preserves the other, since it is the other who is the locus of all signifiers. Notably, Lacan uses the religious idea of blasphemy here to illustrate all this, which in a religious context diminishes a preeminent or supreme signifier, God, to the rank of an object, and thus is also closely related to the notion of idolatry. Now, what about the symptom? What role does it play here with regards to neurosis and the dialectic of desire and demand? Lacan states that the behavioral and symptomatic manifestation of neurosis is structured like a language, but it is a language more akin to full speech, whose meaning is unknown to the subject since it is expressed by the barred subject, that is, the unconscious. Now let us recall that the other is the locus of signifiers, and the other of the other is the regulating force by which the signifiers are chained together and gives rise to speech, and is thus the locus in which the discourse of the unconscious is articulated but not articulable by us. In the subject being subject to the other, the subject is also subject to the conditions placed upon the other's speech, and these conditions, unknown to us, are what make us unaware of what our own demands are really about. The symptom, then, is an expression of such an enigmatic demand. And this allows us to think more fully about the meaning of Lacan's famous dictum that the unconscious is the discourse of the other. Whereas we might previously have thought about this in terms of the repressed subject's discourse with the big other, we might see how that discourse is in fact constituted in the other's discourse with its other, through which I, as a subject, am interjected, and which I ultimately introject. Furthermore, it is the horizon of the other wherein we encounter desire, or the lack of the other. And we, as barred subjects, find our originating location here. I am, as a split subject, born of the split in the other. One might think this means I am completely subject to the symbolic other, that I am nothing other than the other's desire. But we have to keep in mind that what it means to be born of the other's desire means to emerge out of the fundamental insufficiency of the other, and thus unable to be fully reconciled to a symbolic identity. To appreciate what is being said here, Lacan reminds us that the subject is not the self, if by self we mean the individual's presence in the world, nor in terms of the knower and source of knowledge. Instead, the subject, as Lacan is speaking of it here, is thought in terms of subordination, as one who is subject to the other as locus of speech, but also subject to the other as subject to its own other. These two modes of subordination are important because if it was merely a matter of being subordinated to the other as locus of speech, then we might suspect that one could be reconciled with a symbolic identity, that one is, in a sense, fully determined by the symbolic order into which they are created. In also being subject to the other's desire, a certain freedom is introduced here, wherein the symbolic identities that are being given to me are no longer as such on sure footing due to the fact that they derive from a source that is itself incomplete and lacking. Reflecting on the conclusion of the seminar titled Formations of the Unconscious, Lacan emphasizes the complexity of unconscious mechanisms beyond simple developmental or identificatory frameworks. He stresses the importance of understanding the relationship between signifiers to grasp the dynamics of desire and intersubjectivity in psychoanalysis. The seminar has utilized the graph of desire, as it's being called, to help illustrate how signifiers, and particularly the phallus signifier, manifests for the subject. Finally, Lacan underscores the necessity of engaging with the phallus signifier in order to adequately address and interpret neurosis, pointing out that there are limitations in analysis if one attempts to bypass this complex signifier relationship. For the final part of this video, on the final lecture of Seminar 5, I'm going to just focus on the theme Lacan raises here regarding guilt. The analysis of guilt begins with a consideration of its expression in obsessionals, particularly focusing on the paradox where the patient perceives intrusive thoughts as foreign and yet experiences intense guilt over them. And this would be strange because normally we would feel guilty over something we intentionally did. That's the common way of thinking about guilt. And yet here, the obsessional is feeling guilty for things that are not under their conscious control. In particular, those intrusive thoughts emanate from a demand for death, Lacan says, which is the horizon for all other thoughts the obsessional unwillingly encounters in themselves. This demand for death is not rooted in some kind of personal history or specific frustrations, such as with figures like the mother, but it's an intrinsic aspect of the subject's relationship with the other. Now, the obsessional's demand for death leads to what is termed here a death of demand, wherein attempts to articulate this demand result in its dissolution. This dynamic complicates the obsessional's ability to articulate their position and maintain a stable relationship with their desires, which are annulled and yet present in a negative form, often expressed in a disavowed way. So, for example, I might say, it's not that I really feel that way, but there are ways in which we say what we want to say by saying that we're not saying it, or we're not feeling or experiencing it. So how does guilt enter here? We might be led to think that guilt is in relation to law, wherein the obsessional thoughts are violating that law, thou shalt not kill. And this is producing the feeling. However, Lacan insists that law is not necessary for there to be guilt. Instead, guilt is a demand experienced as prohibited. And as such, the sense of guilt appears in connection with the killing of desire. In other words, as Lacan states, guilt is inscribed in the relationship between desire and demand. It would seem that what Lacan is saying here is an early formulation of what he will later say in Seminar 7. That is, the only thing of which one can be guilty is to have given ground relative to one's desire. The obsessional is particularly marked by guilt because they are chronically collapsing desire into demand, and demand itself as a demand for death through disavowing it amounts to the death of demand. And we have to recall that demand is the means by which not only desire is misrecognized, but also the means by which it can be brought into speech. If you want to support this work, you can do so by liking this video, sharing it, and if you haven't already, subscribing to this channel. Other ways to support this work is through the Super Thanks button, where you can make a tip to support this, and on Patreon, where you can be a regular supporter, and through which I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I would like to thank the following for already supporting this work on Patreon. And this finishes Seminar 5. I have to say that in doing the first 3 summary videos and then revisiting everything again through the following videos, it was a little bit daunting for me. And I don't think I will try to start with a summary video because I feel like it made the process a little bit overly tedious on my part. Maybe it was Seminar 5 itself. And I think Seminar 5 is the best seminar that I've encountered since Seminar 2. I think 2 and 5 are like the big ones of this early stage of Lacan. The graph of desire is going to come up again in Seminar 6. It's going to be further nuanced and altered in different ways, and it'll be interesting to see how it is done. But it's yeah, this particular seminar took a lot. Even after going through it about 3 times, there's still areas where I'm uncertain about exactly what Lacan was saying. And I'm hoping that maybe as we continue on in Seminar 6, we'll further clarify or get further elaborations on some of the ideas that Lacan only hints at here. And so we're going to move into the Seminar 6 next, called Desire and Its Interpretations. And I'm looking forward to starting that up very soon. So until then, thank you for watching. Be well.